So let's dive in. Welcome to today's webinar. The theme is Inside the Headlines, What's Next in Government IT Media. And I'm Katie Hanasick. I'm the PR practice lead at REQ. We are a full service marketing and communications agency, and I'm delighted to introduce our panelists. Today, we are fortunate to have Frank Conkle, editor-in-chief of GovExec, Sydney Friedberg, contributing editor at Breaking Defense, Mike Gruss, chief content and strategy officer at Space News, and Daisy Thornton, digital managing editor at Federal News Network. I think we can all agree that government IT media is evolving quickly. Today, we'll dig into some of these changes and how these editors and journalists are thinking about their beats and what we can expect in 2026. So, to get started, I'm hoping that you all could introduce yourself briefly and then share a story on a topic from 2025 that really resonated with your readers and explain why you think those stories made such an impact. And Daisy, I'll start with you. And Samantha on my team will share these articles in the chat so our audience can follow along. Oh, you're on mute, Daisy.
Thanks, Katie. I'm the digital managing editor at Federal News Network. Like you said, I've been working at Federal News Network for about 10 years now. And the story I chose, it was one of our biggest technology stories of the year last year. VA cuts support work for new EHR after canceling hundreds of contracts. And I chose this one because it's got a little bit of everything. It's VA EHR, which is this huge, iconic IT modernization effort that's been going on forever. And VA canceled almost 900 contracts, but then backtracked on about 30% of those cancellations. But the vendors had already laid off the staff, so the big question was who's left to fulfill those contracts? I mean, this has IT, this has contracting reform, this has workforce issues. It's all of the seeds that were planted by this administration in 2025 and that we're watching really closely in 2026 to see what kinds of fruit they bear.
Thank you. Sydney, how about you?
Hi, I am Sydney Friedberg. I'm more used to being the moderator on, or immoderate moderator on panels like this. So I get to ask everyone obnoxious questions, but I'll try to be, as obnoxious as I possibly can in my new, more limited role. I have covered defense and national security and what was not yet called Homeland Security when I started since 97 and grew up in DC, so I'm really immersed. I'm a swamp creature. And I've spent half that time starting in 2010-ish, well, 2011, at breakingdefense.com, which I was, I think, the third hire, and I was 50% of our staff for a few years. And covered a bit of everything, shipbuilding to uh, armored vehicles to increasingly communications networks, information technology, artificial intelligence, which has become my whole beat in the last few years as uh, hopefully contributing editor. Uh, the story that I picked, yep, that's now in the chat, is uh, classic inside baseball in some ways, but it has a lot of significance for a lot of companies. It was about essentially a burst of policy and organizational memoranda that Secretary Hegseth put out on a Monday evening when I was making my kid dinner. So thanks for that. And rushed around that evening and the next morning to figure out where they went for everything from bringing more and more of the sort of innovation centers that have grown up over the last decade uh, under the control of one person, the Undersecretary of Research Engineering slash CTO for the Pentagon, Emil Michael. And I actually had an event of his this morning, which I'm not writing about because I'm on your panel because I love you guys so much. But I'll write about later, where he's actually making available patented technology from defense labs for free in select cases to as a teaser to get people to collaborate more with the labs. And this story, that what's happening this morning is a continuation of this ongoing story about trying to be more open to the commercial industry, trying to make it easier for commercial, especially small firms, or at least tech firms, to work with DoD. And conversely, reorganizing and in some cases even, breaking up some of the traditional programs like Advana that had grown up more in-house with more traditional contractors.
Okay, well, thank you. Mike, how about you?
Hi, I'm Mike Bruce. I'm the Chief Content and Strategy Officer at Space News. I've been covering space and national security or working as an editor since about 2013. Um, Excited to be for the panel. I've worked with Frank and Sydney for a long time, and it's always a good time, and I appreciate everyone joining today. The story I sent along was quite frankly, just from looking at our engagement numbers, this was one of the highest of the year. I don't think it's a surprise. Um, it's about some of the details that came out with the NASA budget, and I think, as Daisy mentioned, these are some of the themes that we're looking at throughout the year. Budget, this was a um, incredibly deep proposed budget cut. Congress ended up not going along with most of it, but did raise a lot of questions, particularly about where the priorities for NASA would be with this administration. I think the number that Jeff Faust used would be the one of the largest cuts since 1961 in the space program. Also, the proposed cut of a third of the NASA workforce, just a giant number. So I think those really influence those kinds of numbers influence a lot of our coverage, meaning, um, you know, what will a new budget look like? Where will those cuts come from? What will it mean for industry? Um, how are the contracts that are awarded being processed? And just even more straight to the point, what is the strategy here, and trying to understand that motivation. So um, that's why I think this was such an important story, because it helps us put into focus exactly what those priorities are.
Thank you. And Frank, over to you.
Thanks, Katie. I'm the editor-in-chief at GovExec, so I oversee all of our journalism and editorial events, of which we had a lot last year, probably one of the more consequential years, our highest traffic year we've ever had, because there was, frankly, a lot of news. We started out with a transition year, which always is impactful. I think this was one of the more, probably the most consequential transition years because of the stark change in priorities. We had covered everything from the early DOGE efforts to, rein in government spending, all the way to the government shutdown, which was a record 43 days long, the eventual uh, loss of about 300,000 federal employees, give or take, from the deferred resignations, layoffs, reductions in force, and a whole lot of priorities in between. But one of the things that caught my eye that I wanted to just harp on, since we're sharing stories, was just sort of the contrast in the optics of the past year versus what actually happened with spending. And so I like to track numbers quite a bit. One of the things that I thought was interesting was, despite all the hype around efficiency and the Department of Government Efficiency and cutting spending, right into the early part of Q4 from last year, it looked like the government was on pace to approach record spending, both in contract spending and in IT spending. Now, the numbers lag a little bit. So when I wrote that story, we were pacing toward $50 billion in IT contract spending in Q4, which would be a record amount. We were pacing toward a near record in just overall government contract spending, which kind of flew in the face of what I thought, the administration was prioritizing, and a lot of what the public sentiment was around all these cuts.
Mhm.
So fast forward a little bit, just in preparing for this panel, I had just dug up. We finally have some figures now from what actually happened, and I'm quite interested to see that we actually did reach within a few million dollars of $50 billion in IT contract spending for Q4. Now that everything's been reported in, and the government actually spent an all-time record in contract spending. So I'm going to have a story on later this week, just to, making with pretty graphs and stuff on this. But contract spending actually grew by just about $60 billion across all areas. That includes defense, that includes civilian agencies. So even with all the cuts, and I think at one point Doge had a dashboard where they were tracking somewhere like $200 billion in cuts or purported cuts from the ceiling value of all these contracts to X stuff. The government actually spent a record amount of money. And that is, I think, even more interesting given that it actually supersedes the last 2 years of the Biden administration when you had a gigantic influx of dollars coming in from the Infrastructure Act and those kinds of things. So even with all that, this year was still a record in spend. And this is a sort of a story that's going to play on into next year, I think, because early on everyone's like, oh, they're reining in spending, they're cutting spending, but actually there's a lot of money being spent, and there is a reprioritization of where those dollars are going. So much more is going to DHS, so much more is going to DoD and on emerging technologies, less so on professional services. So if I'm in the audience, that's kind of something I'm queuing up on how I think about how I position myself with this administration for the next 3 years.
Fantastic. So, Frank, just building on what you were saying, because I think we all started this year thinking that efficiency was the big theme, but some of the spending kind of flies in the face of that. Are you still covering stories related to efficiency, or is that last year's old news?
No, totally. I mean, what I tell government officials and industry execs is, a great way to get attention to what you're doing is to still have numbers backing up what you're doing. So, if you've, working on a story right now in one of the larger agencies where they've saved quite a substantial amount of money on fraud detection, fraud. It's in the HHS department, which is notorious for large numbers of fraud in healthcare benefits, right? Medicare, Medicaid. But emerging technology, especially AI, is playing a huge role in that, and having metrics behind those kinds of use cases critical, right? And there are also good news stories in a lot of cases. I mean, they're not all good news stories, but that's the kind of stories that we'll be looking at telling in the next month or two, and I think is an important way to try to get the word out about what is actually functioning well in government.
Yeah. All right. Thank you. So, Mike, question for you. Um, if we think about some of the themes that you all mentioned in your intros related to budgets and workforce pressure and national security, a lot of those issues also impact space, and I'm sure your team's coverage. How did you see those dynamics play out in your coverage over the last year?
Um, well, I think probably a couple ways. You know, what didn't, there are still milestones that we're interested in. Budgets are still driving a good amount of our coverage. Contracts are still driving a good part of our coverage. I think to what Frank said, that the numbers matter there, and so that's what we're looking at probably the most. And I think that's just in Space News' DNA. That's who we are. That's what we're interested in. I think what's changed is probably where is that money going? Who is winning those contracts? Who are the people who are processing those contracts? There was a, a study or some reporting in the last week or so about Space Force contracts are going particularly slowly right now just because the staff isn't there. So that's something we're interested in. And I think again, what we're trying to understand is what's the strategy here and how is that different from potentially the Biden administration. What we're trying to do is understand that motivation, and essentially our job is providing business intelligence to our readers, and we want to make sure that we're offering that insight so that
Mhm.
when they're reading, they understand, hey, this is something that is going to be prioritized. This is something that's not going to be prioritized. This is what we should expect. So I think that's how it's playing out. I think fundamentally we haven't changed what we're doing, but I do think maybe how we do it and what it looks like is maybe a little bit different.
Okay, thank you. So Daisy, you mentioned AI. I'm curious to get your take on how pressures on the workforce and the expectations that AI would help fill some of those gaps have shaped your coverage, kind of what you're thinking about moving forward. And you're on mute.
I'll figure this out by the end, I promise. Yeah, the workforce angle is huge. It's the elephant in the room in pretty much every conversation we have about pretty much anything we're covering. Like Frank mentioned, this we have about 300,000 fewer feds right now than we had this time last year after RIFs and Doge and the DRP. And the question of how we do more with less has been at the heart of federal for as long as I've been covering it. And that's only becoming even more and more of a question. And AI was supposed to be the answer to that. We kept hearing all year about how AI was going to help fill those gaps. AI was going to make federal workers, exponentially more productive. Um, that's great, but that's all been hype so far. It's unclear what actual ROI it's having for the feds. That's why we're looking at 2026 as kind of a make or break year for agentic AI. Like, can it live up to the hype? Can it fill in those gaps that we're seeing now?
Okay, thank you. We're going to come back to that theme. And Sydney, in 2025, defense procurement increasingly leaned on commercial firms, COTS, and lots of AI investments. How
Mhm.
did that shift change your coverage? And do you see it continuing?
Yeah, I mean, let me actually pick up on Daisy's point about ROI on AI too, because this is something I've been watching as well. Although I think I'm so inured to the claims that it's going to make everyone exponentially more efficient. I just don't even remember people saying that anymore. It just sort of like, kind of like the wah 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 noise that adults make in
Mhm.
Charlie Brown cartoons, right? Nobody believes that. But the thing that AI seems to be really good for is summarizing huge masses of material that no one really should have to read in the first place, and probably no one should have bothered to write in the first place. But because our bureaucracy and Congress require it, we have generated, or because we have so-called fake email jobs, right? We generate these huge reams of useless boilerplate in which are buried, the critical factors like, oh, this contract is for X million dollars, or, people who do not fill in this form by Tuesday will be taken out and shot, right? That's always buried in the boilerplate in the garbage. And AI is actually fairly good at taking stuff that no human should be forced to read and creating a digest that's reasonably accurate. I'm not sure that generative AI has actually shown it's valuable for anything requiring actual thought or for actually reading something that's worth reading. Like if a human could be bothered to do it, a human should probably do it because a human will do it better.
Right.
Now, and a lot, to get back to your actual question you asked, which I promised to do. Uh, I have been in Washington since I was a kid. I've learned how to answer a different question. Uh, is a lot of this commercial stuff is hype, and some of it is just people take their existing software and kind of staple a call out to Chat GPT or some mini model version of it into their existing software. Our company we use Gmail, and now we're all forced to tell Gemini to go away, right, on occasion because it keeps on wanting to help us, quote unquote, like Clippy, back in the day. Uh, but where we and and not, so 90% of those pitches we just ignore. But where a company is actually taking AI, and it doesn't have to be generative AI, there are other forms, obviously, some of which are better for other purposes, and genuinely applying it to a specific Department of Defense mission or business process where they've actually taken the time to not just sort of sit in, Silicon Valley or wherever and code something and, set loose the algorithm on internet data, but actually have gotten together with the actual domain specialists, the military logisticians or the procurement policy contract writers or whatever the case may be, the one who actually does the job and knows the thing, there actually can be a lot of value added. I wrote a story at the very beginning of last year about how Army Materiel Command sort of kludged together a system using generative AI just to take all the presidential drawdown orders for Ukraine and turn them into actionable lists. Uh, they started hand coding that, just usual if then else software. It would break every time the White House changed the formatting on their PDFs. So they ended up using generative AI and actually got it to be accurate. So there is, as opposed to some poor guy, going with a ruler line by line through the printout, trying to find, where we're actually told to send, this many of this kind of truck to Ukraine. So there is real value, and it just takes talking to the company. And I've been talking to a lot of companies over the last couple of years, trying to figure out, what's real and what's not.
Okay, well, thank you. So, Frank, would love to know your thoughts on that. And also, I want to talk about acquisition reform.
Well, I can do both.
Okay,
I would
please.
love to just add to what Sidney said. So, what I think is this a make or break year for AI? I think in the commercial world, because there's been just such a balloon of hype, and there's been so much of the economic gains from the past year are tied to the large AI chip building companies. That may be the case. I think in government, it'll be like the next year or two. I think what happened this past year in both the emerging technology and acquisition front was that this administration attempted to lay the groundwork for how to procure things like AI faster at the speed of the commercial world, at the speed that especially DOD thinks that they need to move.
Hmm.
For one of the first big efforts was the AI action plan from the Trump administration. We've seen a lot of ramifications from that with GSA, OFPP taking leads, rewriting acquisition rules for speed. Right? Speed is the most important thing if you listen to anyone talk in in the uh, in the administration for AI. We need to be able to get this stuff fast. It doesn't, we don't even necessarily want it from established companies. We just want the people who are doing stuff well to have a chance to sell their wares to the government, benefit national security, benefit government operations. Getting to something that Daisy was saying, there is certainly seems to be a desire for AI to replace some of the rote work that was being done by a large number of those federal employees who are no longer within the government. It will, time will tell on whether or not that's the case. I would think that probably it will be somewhere in the middle because we've already seen efforts like the tech force come in and try to bring in talent from outside again after we've sort of whittled down the talent. I will just say though that even in DoD there are case studies now, or at least the basis for some case studies and comments coming out of there that suggest that AI really is going to be a big part of what they're doing. I will just say two examples. One is Sydney had mentioned Emil Michael. He's the chief technology officer for DoD. I just, I follow him. He had tweeted out just 2 days ago, I think, that 1/3 of the entire DoD workforce has logged into GenAI.mil and is incorporating AI in their daily work routines. That address, that GenAI.mil, has only been around for a little over a month. So 1/3 of the DoD workforce using it, I think is substantial. I mean, we're talking, hundreds of thousands of people. So put that aside. And then on the agentic AI, this AI, which is a nebulous concept, but having AI agents do work on behalf of people without necessarily needing to have approvals and that sort of thing. DLA, Defense Logistics Agency, is a great example there. If you listen to their CIO get out and talk, they're doing substantial man hours saved using agentic AI, a combination of companies. And we're talking hundreds of thousands. I think last I checked, there was like 300,000 hours saved of work that would have otherwise had to been done by humans. So there are some case studies, even in the DoD levels, that I think are interesting. Could be a harbinger for the next few years. Could be significant, just over optimism. But I'm not sure that the 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 verdict is in yet. But I'm interested to see how this works. And one other point, Katie, on what you said about acquisition reform,
Mhm.
it's probably the least political, most potentially beneficial of the main priorities from this administration that they've put out, if only because the federal government spends upwards of $1 trillion on goods and services every year, regardless of who's in office and who's not. Finding ways to speed that up, improve the efficiency of contracts that the government engages in, and have better outcome-based contracting, which is a big priority for this administration, should have positive benefits to just about everyone, including taxpayers. And I think that's why the acquisition reform efforts normally, what I would say, are a very unsexy topic, but perhaps maybe the most sexy topic to watch this next year or two.
Okay, thank you. So Daisy, before we move on from the AI topic, I'm curious to get your perspective on what we just discussed. And also, since you are the recipient of many requests from vendors that are interested in contributing content, curious if everybody only wants to talk about AI, like what are you seeing and how can people differentiate their requests to you?
Yeah, I think that's a big thing here is that industry has largely been driving the hype cycle on AI. And as my role handling the contributed content process for Federal News Network, I take all the op-eds and the pieces like that, the contributed articles. The lion's share of them are about AI. They're about agentic AI. They're about, workflow and process optimization. They're about automation. They're about how AI can supplement federal employees. And like I said, it's been a big hype cycle. Like everybody has said, it's been a big hype cycle. We want to start seeing numbers, like Frank said earlier. We want to start talking to the program managers, the team leaders, the federal employees that are actually doing the implementations of these AI pilots, of these AI programs. And we want to start seeing metrics. We want to start seeing, the ROI. Show us the successes. Talk to us about your successes. Or in the absence of successes, talk to us about what you've learned and how you're pivoting. 2025 was all about hype. 2026, we want to start getting into the weeds.
Okay,
Yeah,
thank you.
to chime in on that, I think I've told Katie this too, but I get pitches from companies all the time, and I say, that sounds cool, and I'm happy to talk to you about your cool thing, but it is much more persuasive to me and to a reader that, the special operations major who tried out your drone software or the career DLA civil servant, like Frank was talking about, who, used your automated purchasing management or whatever, talks about, says, hey, I liked this was really useful, and we tried out these companies. That is far more persuasive than, hey, buy the thing that I made. Because we think you might be a little biased about, and you should be, right? If you're not enthusiastic about your own product, you probably are in the wrong job. But we have we actually got so many, not just about AI, but so many op-ed contributions that were frankly unusable, that were basically extremely boring marketing briefs for whatever business the company happened to be in, that were obviously not written also by the person whose name was on them. I mean, come on. Uh, and my editor actually created mid-year. I'm putting it in the chat with you guys, and one of you could reproduce it for the general
Sure.
audience. A whole set of guidelines on how to write an op-ed, and we're obviously a slightly different publication than others, but basically have a point. Don't just sort of say this is a big issue, and we should definitely be thinking about it. And by the way, my company does business here, but actually saying, this is a specific problem or opportunity, and the federal government needs to do X, Y, and Z to better solve it. Uh, that and also write in English. Will always help, and always a struggle with people in both business and government.
All right, well, thank you. And I think everyone will appreciate those guidelines. So, Mike, I'm going to change topics a little bit. I want to talk about Shield Golden Dome, one of the largest procurements in Defense Department history. Curious, how you covered it, and given that there are, I think you said 2,000 awardees, how you think that will impact your coverage in 2026.
Sure. I think, obviously Golden Dome's we've described it as kind of a once in a generation or what appears to be a once in a generation infusion um, of cash into a defense program that could be around certainly for years, maybe for decades, if not longer. The cost projections on it are staggering, just giant figures, no matter how it's built out. Um, we've had conversations in our newsroom that we know the appetite for this subject is incredibly high. So um, I don't want to say the bar for stories is lower, but we also know that people are looking for any tidbit of information they can about this program. And part of that's intentional based on how public that program office has been this far or thus far. We started a bi-weekly newsletter over the summer, and I'll thank you for the softball here, but you can subscribe at spacenews.com/newsletters. We have a bi-weekly newsletter. It starts with 4 kind of explainer pieces about Golden Dome, and then every 2 or 3 weeks we update with all of our Golden Dome news.
Hmm.
Sandra Irwin, who writes about national security space, has a weekly newsletter, and I would say Golden Dome is often uh, a subject each Tuesday in that newsletter. Um, I think because of the public relations strategy for this program, that they talk about transparency and then say transparency means one-on-one meetings in private. There's not a lot of information. We're trying to learn as much as we can. However, I think we have to rely on right now industry probably more than we do for government for news about that program because there are 2,000 companies on this IDIQ. uh, I think simply being a part of that is not necessarily news, which may be a disappointment to some folks. um, but I do think it's an opportunity for us to learn about how they are contributing to this structure. And I had a conversation with someone last night, and they said something that I thought was pretty interesting. It was that this program is not necessarily about innovation. I think that's one of the big themes, particularly in space and in when we talk about acquisition reform. I think that's really what we're talking about a lot is innovation, but that this isn't really a program about innovation. This is a building program and trying to put together pieces that already work. And so I think it is interesting to see who is and is not on these IDIQs and how we can learn from them about what works and what doesn't. But there are so many question marks right now. It's keeping our team very busy.
I'm sure. I'm sure. Okay, thank you. So we had a question from the audience about CMMC, and we've been talking about CMMC for years. But Frank, curious to hear your perspective on how you're making that topic new and cybersecurity in general, what you're seeing as the big trends you're going to be focusing on.
Short and sweet answer to that is that, yeah, it's still a major priority for the Department of Defense. I believe it was November, early November, the 9th, 10th, something like that, where you had phase 1 implementation for it. Most of the big tech evangelists at DoD have talked about its importance. So in terms of whether or not it's relevant, it's highly relevant. In terms of cybersecurity and AI are the 2 areas where spending has increased in both civilian and the Defense Department year over year. I think the last forecast I looked at was expectation around a 15% increase in cyber and AI spending individually. So both,
Mhm.
at least a 15% increase on both of those areas year over year for the next 3 years. So if I'm a company that deals in those spaces, I'm feeling pretty good about the landscape. I would just uh, say that you should try to differentiate or specify what it is you do in those spaces well in your engagements with the administration. I think I found that in talking with a lot of the officials, especially the political appointees who come in, It's not as much about established long-term relationships in companies that they've had in the past, but more or less, what are you doing now? What metrics and numbers and case studies from either in or outside government can you bring to the table in short fashion? It's a lot of like white paper type or less information. I don't want to be bombarded with stuff, and don't use a lot of the sort of jargony words of the day. Just talk about what I always like to use the phrase "get shit done." What are you getting done? That is probably the best thing you can do to differentiate yourselves among competitors with this administration.
Daisy, anything you want to add about how you're covering cybersecurity? You're on mute.
Once again, it continues to come back to the workforce in a big way for us. You had the acting director of CISA talking to Congress yesterday about how CISA is going to move forward with a third of its workforce less than what it used to have. And, there weren't a whole lot of clear answers there. It keeps coming back to how are federal agencies going to do more with less moving forward? They're asking the same question about the IRS right now as we're coming into filing season. IRS lost a lot of their IT shop through DRPs and you know all the workforce changes last year. How is how are these IT shops and cybersecurity shops going to continue to get the work done with so much less staff? And we're just not hearing a whole lot of answers right now. So.
Okay, thank you. So, Sydney, I'm going to give you the floor if you want to talk about CMMC or security, or I'm also interested in how you are planning to cover alternative defense tech, for lack of a better word, as compared to the traditional large contractors that were the recipients of many of those contracts in the past.
Yeah. I confess that I have been allowed to steer clear of CMMC coverage, which is that I had colleagues who took that particular bullet, which is good because it sounds both mind-numbingly tedious and really important, which is a really bad combination. But it's again, our threshold for news is probably different from other publications. Although I think probably none of us, when we all get press releases saying, our product is now CMMC certified or FedRAMP high certified, and all that. I mean, we're happy for you, but that's not news for us. The overhaul to CMMC2 is something we covered a fair bit. From the cybersecurity angle, because I'm an AI guy, I'm always looking for signs, mentioning the ROI theme people have been talking about, for signs that someone's actually applied AI usefully to the defensive side, right? We've all seen, how AI makes hacking and spamming and phishing faster and easier. We can generate more garbage more quickly to deceive more people. The Chinese appear to have weaponized Claude Code at one point. And the defensive side, from everybody I talk to, is kind of lagging in terms of the ability to use AI to detect anomalous behavior, detect potential intrusions, to go beyond, right, the sort of old firewall, castle and moat approach to the more in defense in depth that's implied by zero trust, which implies getting to know your network traffic, what normal looks like, and then be able to see deviations from it at a speed that, and a complexity not a human brain really can't do unassisted. And there are lots of really interesting companies in this space, small and large, to sort of segue into your the second question. I grew up on the traditional Defense Department side, right, where there are like 5 companies you need to talk to.
Mhm.
I mean, shipbuilding, literally, there were 6 shipyards when I covered that, and now there are 5 major, U.S. Navy shipyards actually build seagoing vessels. So you sort of got to talk to the same people over and over again and talk to the same people over and over again in the matching program offices. And, there was a very clear threshold for, oh, they've announced a new requirement or they've announced, a contract for X billion dollars. There was a very clear threshold for now this is a story because a big thing, a big organization gave a big number or, made a policy change that's going to affect big numbers. And the IT world in general, but especially AI and some of this really innovative software and small drones and things, innovative tech like that is not like that at all. There is a huge number of players, many of which are entirely new to the defense space. Conversely, some of which are founded by, some ex-special forces guy who coded it in his spare time and, wanted to fix a problem he saw in the service. And since I became the AI guy for my sins, I've spent just a huge amount of my time just talking to companies, just saying, so who are you? I've never heard of you, but I'm not expected to do. And, what is your cool thing that differentiates you from all the other companies, right? It's not like, oh, our product will make your people exponentially more efficient and, strategically strategize or strategeries, right? Like, wah wah noises, please stop. But, uh, you know, what is the actual thing you actually do, the getting shit done part that Frank talked about? And what is the specific insight or technology or application that's at the heart of your company? Because you find interesting startups, they usually have somebody had a cool idea, right? And it may be a weird idea. It may be like, oh, I spent my university career doing, algorithms for analyzing the tidal patterns in marshes. And it turns out that the same algorithm calculates network traffic flow. So I'm
Hmm.
going to use that, take lift and shift that over to something that actually will, make me some money and be useful possibly for the Department of Defense and the federal government. And that's really interesting. Uh, that makes your company stand out. And actually, we can explain then when you actually win a contract, oh, yeah, we talked to these people a while back, and this is their cool thing, which explains why they actually won this.
Okay. Yeah, no, thank you. So I did get a question from the audience who's curious about when you're covering, here's the question. When covering military and government data initiatives, how much focus do you place on data management challenges like volume, speed, variety, versus the assumption that agencies simply need more, better data?
Oh, wow. Yeah. I
And
just was
one can
talking,
answer
but
that
boy, I
quickly.
can, yeah. Just, I mean, Jack Shanahan, who founded the Joint AI Center, which evolved into CDAO, which evolves into something else, was saying this, 6 years ago, right? A lot of the data is dirty data. It's bad data. It's not properly tagged or labeled, or it's not in a format where, AI can learn to label it for you. And so, yeah, sheer volume of data is and focusing on that, all else is just a recipe for drowning not just your people, but your software and some more stuff than they can handle that and more stuff that's useful. I think the emphasis from the smart program managers and companies I've talked to is on the quality of the data, getting the data that actually matters and into a format you can actually use, not on volume.
Okay. Anyone else have other different thoughts?
I think
Okay.
that's a tough, I would just say, I think that's a tough storyline. That data management challenges are um, just inherently tough to sell an editor on, I would say.
Okay. Yeah. Good to know. All right. So before we move into our final section, I just want to check with you all. Are there other emerging themes that you all are seeing and forecasting that you're going to be covering in 2026 that we haven't talked about? Frank, I know in our prep session you mentioned a couple of big contracts that you have your eye on. So I'll start with you and then we can start thinking about what those emerging trends might be.
Yeah, there's a couple of big contracts. I mean, there's going to be a steady stream of Golden Dome related contracts that Mike already talked about. Sydney did a little bit too. There's one I got my eye on just because I've been covering the sort of uh, impetus. This contract has a lot of roots going back to 2013. So not to date myself, but there's going to be a follow-on to the JWCC massive cloud contract that DoD operates, and why I think that's an important one um, is because the current instantiation of it is a multi-cloud. It's four companies that have a piece of that, which is Microsoft, Google, AWS, and Oracle.
Hmm.
And the follow-on to that, it's a multi-billion dollar contract, is going to more or less encapsulate a lot of the cloud ecosystems that come with those companies. And just why I think that's important is I look at what's happened in the last year or two as a sort of major sea change in government contracting, and especially as it relates to who you're teaming up with to go after government business and who you're partnering with to deliver solutions to federal agencies. It used to be always the SIs and the big prime government contractors were those desired partners. But now I think it more or less is the hyperscaler companies, the big cloud providers, because if you want to do AI at scale, you need cloud computing. You need commercial cloud computing capability to do that. So if you want to do all these things with AI, you need cloud. You also need relationships with those ecosystems that come along with those big companies. And so every new large language model frontier AI company has major relationships with cloud providers.
Hmm.
Um, how the DoD, structures this massive multi-billion dollar follow-on, I think will be really, really important for the future of how it accesses AI from infrastructure to the edge and the edge devices where warfighters will be. So really interested in that. And I think coming back to some of the Daisy said, there were so many reductions in force along with this administration's priorities this year. Government service delivery is still an important priority for the administration. So there's a juxtaposition there, and how the government is able to deliver services across the board with fewer people doing more or less will be really interesting to see if customer satisfaction and customer experience scores across government decline. If so, by how much? Or if something converse happens where you see government service actually make improvements despite reductions in force. I think will be sort of fascinating to see unfold. That's kind
Great.
of a couple
Thank you.
things.
Daisy, how about you? Emerging themes that will impact your coverage in 2026.
Yeah, one of the big things we're looking at is just general budget uncertainties. We're coming out of or we just recently came out of the longest shutdown ever. We're currently on a CR. We've got just over a week until the next deadline. Mike mentioned earlier there were a lot of proposed cuts. Some of them look like they're going to happen, some of them, backtracking. So that's going to drive what a lot of these themes are and what a lot of these, emerging trends are going to be is where is this money being spent? Where is Congress devoting the money and where are agencies spending the money? One of the other things that we are kind of looking at is there hasn't been as much policy direction from the Office of Management and Budget recently. It kind of seems like the federal CIO's office is still getting their legs under them. So we're looking to see kind of, as that happens, what kinds of policy comes out of there and what kind of direction they start pointing things into.
Fantastic. Mike.
Sure. I think a couple things. I think particularly the Space Force is recognizing that there's a whole universe, no pun intended, of threats that maybe they're not thinking about or hadn't pondered. So I know they're rethinking that. For example, what kinds of threats exist on the moon or with the moon and beyond.
Like
Um,
what kinds of threats are you talking about?
Well, particularly, what if there is, we had an event last night, and there was a question about what if there is a race with another nation for the use of helium-3. Lots of questions about that. I think, as I alluded to earlier, there's a lot of questions about innovation and commercial and what that means. I think particularly there is a feeling of industry among industry that this is a great opportunity to win government contracts, to win particularly defense contracts. I think one thing we're looking for is, are those contracts living up to expectations? Are they the size that industry expected, and will they get them over that so-called valley of death, or are they worth the trouble that comes from dealing with the federal government. One thing Sydney mentioned that I just wanted to elaborate on for this audience is, and pardon the terrible metaphor here, but I always think of reporting as kind of this three-legged stool for the B2B or B2G uh, work that this group has been doing. You have industry, you have Congress, and then you have, in our case, that what we're talking about is the Pentagon, but maybe it's an agency. And as reporters, we're talking to each of them, and they're probably telling us something different, and then they're all telling each other something different, and it's our job to kind of triangulate that truth. I think what is harder now is that maybe that stool is a little bit out of whack. That some folks are more willing to talk than others, and Sydney mentioned, just because there are so many more players, so many folks like who see themselves as government contractors that maybe we wouldn't have thought of as government contractors or defense contractors even a few years ago. The point being, with the 2,000 companies on the IDIQ, I don't think we thought of 2,000 space companies, and that's not to say they all are, but that's a big number. And so we don't have those relationships, and we don't know, we haven't developed that trust. We don't have that rapport to say, hey, this is news, this is not news. And I think that's a challenge. And I think that's what makes B2G or B2B reporting in this era right now so challenging, beyond just the fiscal constraints that I think all of journalism is facing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Um, Sydney, emerging trends. You have 2 minutes because I want to leave time for a wrap up.
Sure. Um, my life is a little different because we are a completely Department of Defense focused publication. And, you know, Frank was talking about, the big cloud providers and AI at scale. And obviously, defense does a lot of that, but more than any other agencies, possibly NASA, they are operating uh at the edge. And that doesn't just mean, oh, I'm in Starbucks somewhere on Wi-Fi. It means, I'm in Afghanistan or the Sahel or at sea somewhere. Even if no one's actively trying to kill me, which is a thing that happens, or to jam my transmissions or to hack my network, which is also a thing that happens, I need a device that runs on actually relatively little power
Mm-hmm.
and relatively little bandwidth and relatively little compute, uh, which means a lot of these big general purpose solutions that are, people talking about nuclear power for data centers, right, are not going to work. You can supply a lot of the same commercial solutions to the back office of defense, but the part of the Defense Department that makes it the Defense Department, or the Department of War is the unofficial name that's not technically legally the name. Uh, the war part requires a lot of customization to the mission. And that is where you really have to know your stuff and either have people who've done the mission in your company on your team, or to work very closely with the customer and get a lot of feedback. And there are opportunities, there are units that are eager to do this. Like I was talking to the 11th Armored Cavalry, which is the simulated bad guys at the National Training Center at Fort Irwin, and they're taking all sorts of tech out in the field. They don't have the budget to buy it, but they're getting freebies from companies, and the companies benefit hugely because some of the best trained military professionals on the planet are giving them intense feedback on what works and what doesn't. That goes a lot farther. That kind of experience, that kind of story of that customer interaction is a lot farther than a generic sales pitch.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so as we wrap up, we have just a couple of minutes left. I was hoping that you all could give some advice to the PR, communications, vendor community who would love to get coverage in your publication. So if you would like to share a topic that you would love to see more of, or something that you never want to see again, I'm interested in something helpful to the audience about how they could optimize their opportunities for coverage in 2026. And Daisy, I will start with you.
Yeah, absolutely. So we don't generally talk to vendors or industry unless there's a news purpose to do so. But in terms of the contributed content process, the best thing you can possibly do to get published with us is show familiarity with our audience and our mission. We try to help vets do their jobs. Um, we don't care about products and do our readers. Like Sydney was talking about, so many of the, articles that we get, the contributions that we get are thinly veiled product briefs. If you're going to send me an article about how to improve customer experience, be specific to feds and talk about things that feds are actually doing. The Social Security Administration is talking constantly about how it's trying to improve its CX. Rather than giving me a thinly veiled brief on your CX product, reference what SSA is doing and provide analysis on that. Tell me why what they're doing works, or if it doesn't, tell me why it doesn't. Give me the analysis, not just the products.
Okay, thanks. Mike.
Um, I'd say a couple things. One is surprise. I think that's just completely underrated in most of the pitches we get. That I'm not surprised by what's happening. So I think that has to be part of it. A compelling
You want to be
story.
surprised?
I want to be surprised. I
Okay.
want to be surprised. I think the other part is having conversations and having relationships with reporters so that we can hear more about a compelling story. We can learn more about decision making. We can understand from through industry how DoD or NASA are thinking. I think those are always, as much as I say, yes, we are focused on milestones and yes, we are focused on contracts. I think right now, as I talked about earlier, that if we're trying to understand the motivations and the strategies of what's happening in federal government, I think um, there has to be more information there. Then I think the last part I would say, and this would be me putting I wouldn't traditionally say this as a journalist, but I think what's important is also rewarding the institutions that are doing the best work. I mean, I've told Frank this. I think his team in the last year was absolutely instrumental. Like I was constantly reading their work just to understand what was happening in the federal government and to even think, oh, I need this to understand what's happening with space or defense. And I also think it's important for PR and marketing and marketing agencies to say, hey, these are the institutions we value from a journalism perspective, and we have to support them, whether that means um, subscriptions, whether or not it means working with an advertising team, not an editorial team, but an advertising team with not, I'm not suggesting pay for play here, but working with those teams or, hey, these are reporters that we trust and I value their reporting, so I should reach out to them. But I do think there that it is important to make sure that that correlates with your media diet and there is a tie there.
Okay, thank you. And Sydney, you're going to go next. But before I turn to you, I just want to build on what Mike was saying about supporting um, the journalists and all the work that they're doing. And REQ is a founding member of the Echo Awards, which some of you may be familiar with, which is recognizing and celebrating the journalists that cover the public sector. Nominations are now open, and awardees will be recognized at an event at the Press Club on June 11th. So we would appreciate your nominations, your attendance at the event. You'll be hearing more from all of us about it. So, little plug there. But Sydney, over to you quickly. What's the best way to work with your with you?
Yeah, quickly is good, but you know, doubling down on what Daisy said about knowing your audience, especially for Department of Defense, where a lot of the th they do and the most interesting and important stuff they do has no direct analog in the commercial world, where it has these unique demands on the edge, distributed, denied, interrupted,
Mhm.
limited connectivity, etc. Uh, the generic business efficiency pitch won't carry very far because we've all heard it 100 times. And what really matters is understanding the problem you're purporting to solve. So you can actually achieve that ROI, that getting crap done factor. And that requires in turn either a good relation with the customer where you're, giving them freebies potentially to take your, thing out for a spin
Mhm.
and give you feedback on it, or, and actually better than or having people who were doing that for a living on your team. And not just having sort of the business people and the tech people, but also having the domain experts, as it were, the people who actually specialize in the thing the agency does and understand that and the weird, unique aspects of it, be they legal or technological or tactical. And if you can emphasize that you understand that part and you are getting after that part, uh, it will go so much further. It'd be so much more interesting than a generic, hit the magic AI button and make everything sometimes better so you can fire everyone who works for you and just keep all the money yourself, right? That doesn't carry a lot of weight over here.
Yeah. No, thank you. Very helpful. And Frank, please bring us home.
Well, I don't have too much to add. These guys all cover it really well. I would say make smart pitches, keep abreast of trends in the news in the world. If you're pitching things like op-eds, which we solicit all the time, I'd love to hear from industry. I just would say make sure you're writing, talking about something that is indeed relevant. If you're trying to talk about a case study, like Daisy said, provide some good data. Above and beyond would be suggesting an agency champion or PM that you think might actually be willing to talk. I do find that PAOs are generally happy to help set these kinds of interviews up. And then I think also helpful to meet us as reporters and journalists where we are sometimes, spin the plates, just like we do with industry and officials. I love sending reporters to and going myself to trade shows all over the world, a little bit of homework or prep in trying to set up meetings in advance just to get some of your SMEs, some of your key industry people engagement with press, I think is a smart thing to do. And Mike made a really good plug for what Space News does and some of his reporters. We have a few newsletters as well, especially on the Defense One side, where, if it's touching business, if it's touching, well, really any defense type of news that we would be interested in, even little news scooplets, for that kind of thing. Lauren Williams just launched a new business brief just about a month ago, and really a fan of that. And it's kind of another avenue that industry can think about communicating their messaging and announcements to that may not be a full-blown news story. So anyway, just keep abreast of the news. I know it's crazy. I mean, every day is a busy news day, it seems. That's how it felt for the last year. I think that's going to continue. But that's would be my recommendations.
Well, thank you all. This has been such an interesting conversation. I know we had a lot of value, and hopefully all of our attendees enjoyed the discussion. If you participated today, please link in to our panelists. It sounds like they would love to hear from you. And we will be sending out a copy of the recording for anyone who wants to share it with their colleagues who might not have been able to come. So thank you all, and I hope you have a wonderful
Thank
afternoon.
you.
Thank you so much to all of our panelists. Bye.